So for the first few lessons, we're going to review some concepts from the class before this one, Math 1350 as it's called now. It used to be called Math 350. And so we're going to talk about fractions, even though we covered that in the class before this one. We do this because fractions seem to be such a struggling point for a lot of our students, and sometimes for us, if we're honest. So we want to really make sure that we have a really solid understanding of fractions before we move on to something else. All right, so I want you to think about how would you explain the concept of a fraction to a student who's never seen one before? Okay, so sometimes when we're teachers, we have to try to remember a time when we didn't understand something. That's part of us being able to portray it to someone else. So I want you to pause the video and maybe just take a minute and brainstorm. What are some ways, maybe easy things you could find around your classroom, or easy concepts that a student would really understand that you could explain a fraction like a half, 3/4, and 5/7. So go ahead and pause the video and see if you can brainstorm some of those things. All right, so hopefully you brainstormed, came up with a couple ideas at least. Most of the things that you probably came up with could be fit into three categories: an area model, a set model. Other textbooks often call this the discrete model, but I like set model better. And then lastly, the line model. So I'm going to list some things that I think probably showed up on a lot of your lists, and if you have some other things, then you just need to try to figure out where they fall in this list. So the first one we'll discuss is the area model. Now, an area model is where you take an overall object or item and you split it up into pieces. So you take one whole and you split it up into pieces. So often I hear teachers using pie or pizza. Anytime you can relate math to food, students seem to understand it better. So notice we would have a whole pizza or a whole pie and we're splitting it up into pieces. Notice those are both circles also. You can also, maybe not as mainstream, but you can use Hershey bar pieces. But really anything where you have one whole item and you're splitting it up into pieces would be considered an area model. We're going to look at a manipulative version of that in just a bit. All right, the next model is called a set model. A set model is when you have a set of items and you split them up into groups depending on what fraction you have. So some of the more common tools for that is maybe to use M&Ms or candy pieces, because those are kind of readily available. Any sort of like quarters or coins. We wouldn't, in this case, really be talking about the value of money. We would just be talking about, you know, I have a set of 10 coins and what would half of those be. But you can also use your students. For instance, if you have 20 students, you could partition or split them up into groups and talk about different fractions there. And so again, there's many, many different examples. I'm just putting some of the more common ones. And then for a line model, that is where you're going to be either folding or cutting or splitting in some way a line up into equal sized pieces. So often teachers will use a string for that because you can fold it, you know, yarn, something like that. You can also use measuring tape or a ruler for students a little older or where you've talked about measurement in some way. You probably wouldn't use measuring tape or ruler unless they understood the concept of measurement first. So most of the things that we could think of could fall into these three areas. So we're going to talk about, throughout the lessons this week, we're going to talk about different ways we can discuss fractions, different ways we can relate these concepts to students. Okay, so when we try to discuss fractions, I'm going to draw just a little rectangle here. Let's say that I want to use an area model. So let's say that I split this area model up like so. And let's say I want to look at just this piece right here. Okay, the piece that I shaded in. So my question is this 1/2? Now I think we know that it's not, right? So notice that the problem with this, right? So if we only talk about fractions as pieces of a whole, then we miss a really important part. So notice these pieces aren't equal size, and that's a problem. So when we describe fractions to students, we want to make sure that we really emphasize that quality. Okay, so a lot of times I will hear people explain fractions as 1/2 would be 1 out of 2 pieces, and that's partially correct, but it's not complete. So this is 1 out of 2 pieces, but not 1/2. Okay, so when you talk to students, you want to emphasize that they have to be pieces of equal size. And honestly, that won't be difficult. If you've ever worked with kids before, you know that kids understand the concept of fairness. If you've ever tried to give multiple kids snacks and split those snacks up equally, they understand the concept of fairness. So just make sure you really emphasize from the very beginning when you're discussing fractions with your students that we want to make sure these pieces are of equal size. If they are an area, we want to make sure that area is of equal size. If it's a set, we want to make sure the set, little subgroups or groups are of equal size. And if it's a line model, we want to make sure that that line is of equal size as well. And something else that'll help you as we go through some of these manipulatives is when asked to describe a fraction, always relate it back to the whole when possible. So that's going to help you when you are teaching maybe more difficult fraction concepts. All right, so I want to show maybe just on paper some different types of manipulatives or different types of things that you could do. So let's take example 1. Let's use an area model to show 3/4. So we're going to use an area model from one of our lists up above. So let's just use like pizza or a pie. So a lot of times we are more visual learners, our students are as well. So if I told you to show 3/4 of a pizza or a pie, we would need to have a circle. Okay, that's not the best circle in the world, but it'll do, right? And we want to make sure, again, we're going to emphasize fairness with our students. We want to make sure that this pizza is going to get split into 4 pieces, 4 equal size pieces. So I'm not using a ruler for this. I'm just kind of winging it. And notice that they're not perfect, and that's not really what I would be looking for. But try to make the pieces look the same size. And notice each of these measures 1/4. So any one of these pizza or pie slices would represent 1/4. But then we want to talk about 3/4, and so often when we want to talk about a part of a whole, we will use shading to indicate like which area we want. So I'm just going to shade 3 of these quarters or 3 of these fourths, and that's what the definition of 3/4 is. So notice we probably already knew that 3/4 was bigger than a half, but this is a visual representation that clearly we are at greater than a half of that pizza or the pie. And so a lot of times we're going to use shaded areas. So the shaded area is 3 pieces, and each of those pieces is of 1/4 size. All right, so let's talk about just a really basic set model, and then we're going to look at some specific manipulatives. You're going to have to refer to the worksheets that I uploaded here in a bit. So let's just take the same fraction. So use a set model to show 3/4. Okay. So the set model is a little trickier, not terribly, but a little trickier. We would need to make sure when we were setting up this problem that whatever number of sets we set up, that it was divisible by 4. So I'm going to start with a set of 8 items. And so if I wanted to show 3/4, just like I did with my area model, I would need to split this into sections of 1/4. So notice if I'm going to split this up evenly, then 2 units are going to have to be in each little subgroup. And notice each of these subgroups represents, again, 1/4. So we always label each of the sections or groups or whatever. And then if we want to indicate, we just shade in. Here's 1/4, right? Here's the 2nd fourth, and here's the 3rd fourth. Okay, so again, we're going to say that the shaded groups, there are 3 of them, are each representing 1/4 of the whole. Okay, so that's a basic set model. And then last but not least, let's show a basic line model. So for a line model, it's really kind of up to you. You can have your students measure it, but remember, you're going to be introducing concepts before maybe you have introduced concepts of fractions, maybe before you've introduced concepts of measurement. So really, I don't usually have students measure it here. But what you would want to make sure is, notice I am splitting the line that I chose into 4 equal pieces. Okay, and the reason I did that is because, again, I'm talking about 3/4. So these are each of 1/4 length. Notice here I'm talking about the length of each section. Okay, if I wanted to talk about where it was actually on the number line, I would do something different there, right? So this would be a concept of how you wanted your students to write it. But if I were going to write this on a number line, this would be 0, 1/4, 2/4, 3/4, and 4/4. But what I wrote there in purple would probably be a little more advanced topic. So if I want to talk about a length of 3/4, notice I'm using this bracket to indicate that I'm not talking about a location. I'm talking about like a section of that line. Okay, so from 0 to this spot in the line represents 3/4 of the line. Okay.